Hey guys, this is Jeff Stanek with Figured Out Baseball. We've got a great Figured Out Baseball podcast for you today in our series that we call the Real Dirt Podcasts. It's a little bit of a different spin from our normal podcast where we sort of jump all over the map as far as the topics that we talk about in our Real Dirt podcasts. If you haven't heard them before, we spend the entire podcast talking about one very specific subject. That way, anybody that is interested in that subject hopefully learns all that they want to, and we sort of have a complete conversation. We get our hands dirty with it. That's why we call it the Real Dirt Podcast. In this podcast, we're lucky enough to be joined by Charles Bolden. He is currently the head coach at Wisconsin-Eau Claire, a Division III school in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And in this podcast, we are going to talk about Bunts Are Essential. That's the name of our podcast today, Bunts Are Essential. And this is based on a tweet from Charles a few months back, which I'll read you in a minute. Before I go into that, I do want to give you a background on Coach Bolden. And even before we get into that, today's podcast is brought to you by Crossover Symmetry and armcare.com. Here's the background on Coach Bolden that I've got for you. He's originally from Oak Park, Illinois. He played collegiately at the University of St. Francis, an NAIA school in Joliet, Illinois. Coaching background, he coached at Chicago State, a Division I school in Chicago. He was then an associate head coach at Illinois Tech, a Division III program where he was the hitting coach and recruiting coordinator for some really good offensive teams there. He also spent time scouting and coaching for USA Baseball's National Team Identification Series. He's coached high school baseball. He founded a travel organization called the Midwest Havoc. 2022 will be his second year as the head coach at Wisconsin-Eau Claire, which I found out only before we started recording that they once had a program, dropped it, and then brought it back. And Coach Bolden has been the one that's been brought on to restart the program. So again, 2022 will be the team's second year back. And I want to read you before I bring on Coach Bolden and start asking him questions, let him introduce himself or say whatever he likes. I want to read you the tweet that kind of started this whole conversation and is the reason why we're having this podcast today. Back in February of 2022, Coach Bolden posted a tweet that said, "Let's start getting back to making baseball simple again. Bunts are an essential part of the game. It busts you out of slumps, changes the scoreboard, and puts pressure on the opponent. A well-placed bunt will get the squad just as fired up as a bomb." And that kind of a tweet sometimes that is a little bit different than what you would traditionally hear or what a lot of coaches maybe teach the game differently at different levels of baseball. But to me, this is what college baseball is kind of a lot of college baseball teams believe in what you wrote, Coach. And I'm really excited to talk about it on the podcast today. So I certainly appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Yeah, first, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate all the great work that you do. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for reaching out. I'm glad to be on and love talking about the small ball aspect and the element of baseball that puts the pressure on the defense.
So the first thing that I'd like to ask is, like, for people, I don't know who's going to listen to this. I don't know if only the people that sort of buy into this are going to listen, or if the people that, don't buy into this are going to listen and want to see what you have to say. I don't know what our audience is going to be for this podcast specifically, but, do you really believe what you wrote? I mean, do you really believe that a well-placed bunt will get your squad just as fired up as a bomb will, in addition to the other stuff, but does it really get the team going like that? I mean, is that something that you've experienced?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've as a player myself and as a coach, when I've called it, when, nothing's, I was a lefty hitter, so nothing more sweet than putting down a drag bunt down third base and watching the pitcher slip and fall and, trying to handle the throw or them handling the throw and throwing it away and we getting extra bases. The dugouts go crazy, man. And me as a coach, I'm firing up the team as well when that happens. So absolutely, and that starts a rally, and it gets you going. And then now you got the defense thinking, you have them on their heels, and that's what you always want to do, at least from my standpoint. We try to make the defense become perfect and force our hands for them to make the best play possible. So, yeah, absolutely, man. I've heard some of the loudest roars from a drag bunt, getting it down, and that pitcher, like I said, slipping, or the third baseman coming on and not being able to make the throw or leading it to another base. So, yeah, absolutely. I don't say many things I don't mean. I know I'm opinionated, but 100% I mean it.
Keeping the defense on their heels is something that I think is really an underrated part of bunting and of the small game, because like you said, you want to make that defense be perfect. And, the other style of baseball that's not a small ball or that doesn't, I don't know that saying that an offense that bunts is necessarily a small ball team, because, teams that bunt can often are in most cases, I think, hitting a lot of extra base hits too. It's just another weapon that they've got. But putting pressure on the defense is such an underrated part of using the small game. Do you do that? Do you only bunt on teams that you don't feel like are that strong defensively, or is this a tactic that you will use basically any game when the situation dictates? Is it only on days when like maybe the weather, it's a tough day to score runs if the wind's blowing hard in? Like, is this something you use all the time, or only sort of when, weather situations or the opposing defense sort of tells you that this can be a weapon today?
That's actually a great question. It really is. And I think from my standpoint, we use that a part of our arsenal in any time. Doesn't matter who we play. It doesn't matter the situation. That's a part of our identity as a team. So whenever the, situation calls, we're going to do it. And, the expectation is to execute it in a high manner and just get it done. But that's a part of our identity, man. The home runs, all that stuff comes to the extra base hits. We do that too. So we like to be a well-rounded offense, but the small game is something it's a part of what we do. It's blue gold baseball.
So you guys do hit extra base hits occasionally as well.
We do. If you look at the current stats as far as home runs, we're up there with everybody else in our conference as it stands today. So yeah, we do that as well.
I say that as a joke. Like as a college coach, I'm not a very big guy. Like I was really good at handling a bat as a player, and I coached the small game and base running as a coach at many of my college stops. But it was something like I took a ton of pride in. And like, as I coached first base at most of my stops, and, when we couldn't get a bunt down, like I took that personally. Like I felt like that was my responsibility. If we called for a bunt and couldn't get it down, that was on me as much as the player, as a coach. So no, I say that tongue in cheek, like, because I think a lot of people that are anti-bunt think that a team that only bunts, that's their only weapon. But like, to me, a really good rounded offense has a lot of different ways to score runs, and bunting is just one of those ways.
Yeah, you want to be a Swiss Army knife. You don't want to be a one-trick pony. If we're only, especially us being a Midwest state where it's cold most of the time, if we only rely on extra base hits and home runs, we're not going to have an opportunity to score as much as we could if we use other elements of offense. I want to be able, I mentioned Swiss Army knife. I want to be able to have a team that can do everything. So we're prepared for every situation in every game. In high leverage situations, with the game on the line, we may put down a squeeze. We may do it in the first inning. I just want to do as many things as possible to have options, right? You talk about, diversifying your portfolio, people do with stocks and different things like that. It's no different in how you build an offense and how you build a team. You just want to be able to do everything really well at a high level. And those typically are the teams that are the most successful.
I love that metaphor there, especially the financial planning side of me. What's a good bunting situation? You kind of mentioned there that sometimes like you might squeeze to add a little pressure and maybe to add an extra run. Like what are some things some situations that you would consider good bunting situations? Because, and not to put words in your mouth, but I'm assuming that you wouldn't just, there are times when you'd rather guys swing away. There are times when you'd rather bunt. Are you bunting to add an extra run when you feel like one extra run can really be the difference here? Are you bunting when, you have certain guys at the plate and you don't love the pitcher-hitter matchup? Like, what are some situations, Coach Bolden, that you see come up during the game where, like, that light goes off in your head, like, this is a good bunting situation? Is that a fair question? I know maybe it's a million situations, but are there a couple that you can sort of bring up to help the coaches that are listening to this that may want to incorporate this into their own team's offense?
No, I think there's a lot. That's a good question. I think there's a lot that goes into it. I think it depends on if you got a guy in the box that's struggling and you want him to kind of break out, him putting the bunt down can build his confidence, or if he's hitting the ball hard right at people, it just changes his mental makeup and how he goes about things. Just actually seeing a hit go on the scoreboard and in his head, he can change, and gain more confidence from that. I think a situation where you want to get out of a double play, A runner on third base, the first and third, second and third, where we can move some runners over and get them in scoring position or either get ourselves in a position to score. I think a lot of it is determined on what the game is telling you, so it's feel. I don't ever have a preconceived opinion about things. I always kind of go based off of what the game is showing me, so it could adjust on the fly, right? So we do a number system with our signs. So the first pitch, I could tell a guy to have fun. And then I may see that the third baseman's back, and I may see something with how the third baseman's holding him or the shortstop's holding him on, and we can get more space and we can get a bunt down, or I may see what they did previously on a bunt coverage earlier in the game. So I think so much of it is determined on what the game is kind of showing in front of you and just paying attention to those small, minute details about what the other team's showing you as well.
Today's podcast is brought to you by armcare.com and Crossover Symmetry. If you want to build cannon arms that stay in top condition all year, check out armcare.com. Developed by Crossover Symmetry, armcare.com measures players' arm strength and range of motion and delivers customized prep, strength, and recovery training based off of each player's wellness scores, strength needs, throwing workloads, and fatigue. It gives you the tools to keep your players at their peak all season. So check out the team packages on armcare.com and gain a competitive advantage in player development. Your players will be healthier, throw harder, and win when it counts. Crossover Symmetry and armcare.com. Part of your tweet was about busting guys out of slumps, but let me come back to that one. And I want to first ask you about the different kinds of bunts that you use. I think that the anti-bunt crowd, especially on social media, which I feel like I talk about social media probably too much on here, but I think it's just a big part of baseball because I think baseball guys, a lot of them are on social media, and whether they participate or not, like you hear what's on there. But I think the anti-bunt crowd, a lot of it is anti-sack bunt. Do you sack bunt? And can I ask you what other kind of bunts you use? This may be a long question, but do you drag? Do you push? Do you squeeze? Do you sack? Do you safety? Do you do all those things? Are there some of those that you prefer over others? So let me start out with: do you sack bunt? And if so, when?
I do. So I'll give you an example. Yesterday in the game we played, I got a real life example that just happened. And the situation I did is very unconventional in somebody who, would maybe do it with less than one out. Some people have certain rules. I don't. Again, I let the game dictate kind of what we do. So we're in a tight game yesterday, and this is a conference game. We're up 2-0. And this late in the game. I don't think we scored until the 7th inning yesterday. So this is a tight game. Every run counts. We have a guy come up, he bunts. It's 1 out already. Runner on first base, he bunts. There's a left-handed pitcher on the mound. I felt really good about the guy on deck getting a hit. So our guy puts the bunt down, great bunt. We get our runner to second base. The next guy comes up, first pitch, jumps on it, hits a missile. That guy from second scored, and it gives us another run. So now we're up 3-0. And our guy on the mound threw a complete game yesterday. He absolutely shoved. Just having that come through in that situation gave him more run support and made him feel better about what he was doing. But a lot of coaches wouldn't have done that in that situation, So we did it in a tight game where every run counted, and I had to believe and trust in the rest of the team to come through and that next guy on deck to come through in that situation. If he pops up, I look like a dum-dum, but if he gets that hit and comes through, I look like a genius. So thank goodness it worked out, and my gut told me the right thing to do. But, that's a situation where that was huge in that moment, late in the game like that. And it's unconventional, but it's what my heart was telling me and what my feel for the game was telling me. And it worked out great.
That's something you don't hear very much, especially bunting from first to second with 1 out already. So a lot of guys will only bunt maybe from second to third with nobody out, or from first and second to second and third with nobody out, or whatever. But you're okay with bunting guys to second base, and not just bunting them from first to second, but doing it with 1 out from time to time. Like you said, you don't necessarily have any hard and fast rules. It's kind of whatever you feel like based on game situation, the lineup, who's due up, what the pitcher hitter matchup is. Like, you'll even go from first to second with 1 out. That's not unusual for you guys.
Absolutely, man. There is no set anything. I try to tell these guys all the time, just because you're coached certain things, the game can change, and the game is so fast when it's live. You got to be able to adapt, So that was, that's something that was probably as good of an example as I can give, And you mentioned what type of bunts. You covered them all: push, drag, safety. We do all of that.
Okay. How much time do you spend practicing bunts, and when do you do it? So I like to ask some practical questions in the podcast, because I'm always looking at this thing like these podcasts like a practical coach. Like, okay, if I'm coaching a high school team right now, I not only want to know like the things that you do, but I also kind of want to know how you do it or how I can incorporate it. So can you tell people how often you practice bunting, and in what situations? Like, are you doing it in the cage, like as part of their normal BP rounds? I know at some of the schools that I coached, we would try to set up like a machine close, between home plate and the backstop. Like, we would have guys bunting with a machine throwing from 20 feet away or whatever, and have some cones set up. I know other schools have practice fields where, like, I know at Coastal Carolina, I can remember playing back there back in the day on their practice field, like they had, bunting areas sort of painted in the grass. Like, how are you guys incorporating that into practice, and how often, and in what situations?
Sure. I mean, well, it starts off us talking about it and them understanding how important it is, and this is our team identity, and we do need to get this done. So if coming from me, being the head coach, and me expressing to them how serious we need to take it, they understand the importance of it when they do it and they go through it in practice. So not just making it a normal routine. A lot of teams just bunt just to do it, right? But I'm explaining to them how important it is and how this is going to help us win games. So they know that just coming off the top. And I even go over that when we recruit them, and that goes into how we recruit. But we do it every time we hit. So obviously some days we'll have hitting days specifically only, and then we'll have team days where we go over team defenses and situational things. But every time we're doing something with the bat, they're bunting. So when they get in the machine, they're bunting. And then we actually have a bunt station. So we do rotations of different hitting exercises when we go through our hitting days, and having a bunting station with 4 cones, 2 set up to the right side and 2 set up to the left side. They're cognitively going over it all the time and making sure they get it in that perfect spot.
Can you talk about how you get guys to buy into it? Because I know that these kids are hearing a lot of the same stuff that that I might be hearing, or maybe, I don't know, maybe some guys have their high school and travel coaches in their ear, like, you guys are bunting up there? Like, you're a middle of the order guy and you're bunting, you're working on bunting. How do you get your players to buy in? Like, it's one thing just to, I guess, to talk about it. It's one thing to say, like, this is something we're going to do, but you as a coach have to get your players to buy in, because anybody that's ever coached bunters or called for a bunt in a game, like, if a player's heart is not in the bunt, he's not going to get it down. So How do you get guys to buy into this and this style of offense so that they want it as bad as you do when you make the call? And they're not, like, I think what coaches are afraid of is that, like, they might, they give the bunt to a guy, and a guy's in the hitter's thinking, oh man, the coach doesn't trust me to get a hit, like, and he kind of has some bad body language. He'd rather swing than bunt, so the intent is not quite there. How do you get guys to buy in so that you are a successful bunting team?
That's a good question. I think a lot of they want to play, right? So in order to play in this lineup, you got to be able to do it. And I mentioned that as far as how I recruit them. But a very valid point in what you said is telling them one thing, but then them actually having to do it in the game. That's a whole different mindset. But we're going to put the people in the order that can execute what we need to do. So if you talk to any player, they want to play. Not many guys will tell you they want to sit on the bench. So a part of being in our lineup is a part of being able to do it. But I think also there is that, because not everybody buys into it. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and say every player I recruit, or when I call it all the time, they're 100% convinced. And it's happened where I've been like, you know what? If you're not convicted to do it, I'm not going to have you do it. If you don't have the confidence to do it, you won't do it. Again, I'll find somebody else that can get the job done, but in that moment, I take it off. But really, it's just a matter of them seeing it in games. So, and I think that was something. I'm sure some guys came into this season when I would call it before, but now we played 12 games. We've won. I'm not kidding you. We've probably won 3 games off a small ball in bunting. So now they see that it actually translates to wins. And coach actually knows a little bit about what he said. You know, I'm not just saying it for coach talk. I'm saying it because over my years and experience, it's led to victories. You know, so that's most of it, but they have to see that. And I think that's important. And I think the fact that they have seen that it's led to us getting wins, now everybody's more apt to do it, and they have that mindset that they want to get it done. And I make a point to praise those guys when they do it right. You know, when those guys put down good bunts, I want everybody out of the dugout giving them high fives and let them know that they did a great job. So that's a lot of it as well. It's feeling like your job is important. Everybody's got a job to do. And everybody has to do their job and not worry about outside factors, and that's a part of it.
I can't tell you how much I like what you just said. All of that is just so – those are, in my opinion, ingredients to a winning program. Like it doesn't matter if you're talking about bunts or talking about pitchers throwing X number of strikes or talking about playing good defense or you know, outfielders throwing to the right base or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. I think just those things you said are such important ingredients to a winning program. I know that the one, you know, I coached high school baseball for 1 year, right? And it was after I left college. But in that 1 year, I felt like when we really needed like one more run to, in my opinion, like to just put a little bit extra pressure on or seal the deal or whatever, I felt like we needed one more run. Like if I had a chance to squeeze and I had a good bunter at the plate, like we were going to squeeze. And a lot of times I would give a guy an opportunity to drag the first attempt and then maybe a pitch or two later try to squeeze again. But I felt like it was I'm a percentage guy. I'm an odds guy. It's just kind of how my brain works. And I know that our odds are much, much higher to score a run with a guy on third less than 2 outs squeezing than it is to try to swing away. And to me, there were times I'm like, if we need this run, this is how it's going to happen. And anyway, I certainly like coaches that are just – I like coaches that make it about the team more than the individual, and there's nothing more of a team thing than a bunt where you're literally giving yourself up, you know, to help your teammates out.
Yeah, that was a great point. I mean, yesterday, so going back to that situation because it's so relevant and new. You know, I praised that kid that got the bunt down more probably than the kid that came up after and actually made me look smart and got the hit. You know, and I told that kid that, hey, you're the reason why this run scored. You know, and just telling him that and voicing that to him, I hope at least that he felt like, hey, man, I did my job. I'm the reason why we got that run. So just stuff like that.
So you've sort of answered this question, but I want to come back to it. Do you bunt? Will you bunt 1 through 9 in your lineup, or are there certain guys that are good enough offensive players that you really, you know, probably would never bunt with them? And I would just you know, just real life question. You don't need to name any names, obviously, but just again, looking at this from a coach's perspective that might want to incorporate some things that you do. Is there anybody? Would you bunt with anybody given when the situation is right, 1 through 9 in the lineup?
I would, but typically my run producers, I don't, because they can change the game in so many different ways, especially with runners on. We want them hitting with runners in scoring position. That's the goal of what we're doing with the run producers, and that's maybe three guys. But I would. I'm not opposed to it, and I have definitely had that happen before. But I'm just going off my history. Typically, my run producers generally don't bunt in those situations. I'm typically bunting to get them at bats that they're having those runners so they can eat with the RBIs. So, but I definitely don't have any kind of, you know, hesitancy at all to have a 3-hitter bunt if we need them to do that in a situation where it calls for it.
You talked earlier about breaking out about how bunts can be a good way to break out of slumps, and I told you we'd come back to it. We have a few minutes left here in recording time. What's the conversation with a player who's maybe going through a rough time, whether he's not seeing the ball well and he's just not putting great swings on it, not making great contact for the last handful of games, or maybe a guy that's just kind of hitting balls at people and is feeling a little bit frustrated that he's not getting hits, not able to help the team? How do you approach a guy like that as far as like, hey, man, a bunt can help you, help us, help everybody? Just kind of, you know, curious about how you approach that as far as like bunts being a slump buster for some guys.
Yeah, so I'll talk to him and having those conversations. How do you feel with your swing? You know, do you feel mechanically you're doing everything right? Because it starts with that. If they feel like they're doing everything right and they feel good, okay, so you're in a good spot, right? So don't try to change anything. Don't try to reinvent the wheel here, right? If you're feeling good and you're doing everything right and just the odds of baseball are baseball and it's not going your way, hey, put a bunt down here. Change it up a little bit. And that'll get you going. And that's kind of how the conversation goes. So a lot of it is mechanically to start. And we work from there. If there's obviously mechanical issues we need to go over, that's a whole different type of, coaching kind of strategy that and conversation we're having. But if they're feeling good with their swing and they're doing everything right, they just aren't getting the results, hey, let's change it up. Or if it is a guy, hey, man, to build your confidence, if you are doing some things wrong, maybe mechanically, let's change it up still and get a bunt down. We need you in this situation because you're doing something to help the team. And, again, you're building that confidence. So those are kind of the conversations that we have.
Does that work? I mean, if a guy is in a slump, whichever kind of slump it is, does that honestly work? Does that build a confidence up in a kid if he bunts for a hit, or if he just puts on a sack and has a team at bat, right, and does something good and he gets those high fives and go back to the dugout? Do you honestly believe that works to help bust guys out of slumps sometimes?
1,000%, because baseball, out of every sport, it's the most mental draining sport. So, and everybody wants to contribute, right? I may get mad at them, and all coaches get mad at players for not, achieving, but this is a really difficult sport. And I think we have to keep that in context. This is so hard. All the odds are against you in baseball. So anything that you're doing, people want to help. Nobody wants to strike out 3 times. I've met one player that goes to the plate hoping they strike out. So anything that you're doing that puts the team in a position to be successful, that's a positive thing, and that's something you should build off of. And you're feeling good, right? You're 0 for 5, but you put down a squeeze bunt. Now you got an RBI. Right? And now you did something to help the team, and now you're feeling better about what your contribution is to the team. So that's so much of it. And then also, absolutely, I can give you an example. So we've got a guy going for us again yesterday, same situation. He's been hitting the mess out of the ball, and he put down a drag bunt yesterday. We had that same conversation we just talked about. He stole second, stole third. We got a sac fly from one of our big boppers, and we got a run in that same game. That was that 3-0 game that was tight, where we needed every run to count. And, he had been doing everything right in the swing, just right at people, and he did it, and he got on base and contributed with his speed, and he changed the game with that. So, yeah, another real-life example to how it correlates every time.
Coach Bolden, last question I want to ask you. Do you believe that an on-point small ball team, a team that can execute the small game when necessary, does that become more important, less important, or relatively the same in a big game? So, for example, I know your goals are high there. You want to compete. You expect to compete for conference and national championships at Eau Claire. The further you go into playoff situations in college baseball, do you believe that being able to execute the small game will become more important, less important, or relatively the same as it is during the regular season?
I think the importance doesn't change, but I think in those games you're typically playing better teams. So every little thing that you can do right in that situation, it counts. And that was one of the conversations I actually had with my team before we started. These conference games, it's never going to be a cakewalk, right? And in those tense games, it comes down to what teams executed the best. Right, and who did it's not the things that you see on paper, it's not the strikeouts, it's not the home runs, it's the small things, like even hitting a double cut, the guys knowing what spots they have to be in, and placing the bunt in the right direction, not just getting the bunt down, but placing it in the right, position of where it needs to be and where it's called, to where you come through and you execute. Against better teams and high leverage games, it comes down to the small details that matters the most, because you're playing against 2 good teams. So you both have good pitching, you both have good defense, right? You both have teams that can do things offensively. It's the team that can execute the small parts of the game the most that are more times than not going to be successful, because it comes down to those situations, right? Like any little thing in a 0-0 game can change the outcome of it. So everything is so important when you're doing that, and you have less room for error, because that team's not going to make a mistake. So, yeah, everything is super important with the leverage of the games and just being able to, execute the things that people don't see in the box score always necessarily, because you have less room for error.
Just like bunts are really They are essential in the game of baseball. This podcast has been really essential to this website. What a terrible segue. Charles, this has been great. This is Charles Bolden, everybody. This has been a really, really good podcast. Like, if you weren't convinced that bunting needs to be a part of your offense and you listen to this whole podcast, I hope that you're convinced now. I don't see how you wouldn't be, and I don't see how you wouldn't think this is an important part of just being able to be a consistent offense. But this has been a great podcast. Again, a part of the Real Dirt series that we're going to call Bunts Are Essential. Today's podcast, again, was brought to you by Diamond Kinetics. I really enjoyed this podcast. I think that everybody here learned a lot from it. Hopefully they did. And Coach Bolden, I hope to have you back again. This was a really, really enjoyable podcast. It's been a lot of fun to get to know you, and I appreciate all that you gave to the podcast and to all of our listeners today.
Again, I thank you so much. I mean that, and I so appreciate and respect what you do for the game of baseball, and your passion is similar to mine and how you want to see it grow. You do outstanding work, some of the best work in all of baseball at every level, starting with youth, because that's where it starts. I'm super grateful for this opportunity. Love to come back, but again, just can't praise you enough in the work that you do with your company.